Greece has just 4 weeks to find a way to make its repayments for the country.
Ja, diese Varoufakis, der neue Finanzminister Varoufakis,
Syriza.
750.000 Euro Auto aus Deutschland.
Les intentions du gouvernement grec.
Payments for the country will quite simply run out of money.
Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. Here are some of the media stories we've been tracking. Greece, round 2. Last week, we looked at the domestic media on this story. This week, what are the European media reporting? Rupert Murdoch and News Corp dodge a legal bullet in the U.S. Aid workers, how, on humanitarian stories, they can drive the news coverage. And
I have absolutely nothing to say whatsoever.
the TED talker who has absolutely no idea. When Greece's Syriza party was voted into power last week, the media narrative was already in place, since all of the polls had indicated that Alexis Tsipras would be the next prime minister. So the headline writers were ready, with pronouncements that a party from the radical left would bring the country to ruin and possibly take the rest of Europe down with it. In one way, Syriza did make it easy for them. The party's name is an acronym that translates to the Coalition of the Radical Left. But once you get past the label and look at the policies, are they that radical? Ever since the first days of the financial crisis back in 2008, the consensus in much of the mainstream news media, the vast majority of which is corporate-owned, has been that harsh, even brutal austerity measures are something that Greeks simply must live with. This past week, Syriza has been chipping away at that line of thinking. The party's frontman in this debate is Yanis Varoufakis, its new finance minister. Ostensibly, his whistleblowing tour was built around meetings with European finance ministers. But it was also designed for the news media, and it was no mere charm offensive. Varoufakis was out to subvert financial doctrines, as well as dress codes, and was dealing out sound bites that turned into broadsides, slamming into the walls of conventional economic thinking, particularly in Germany, where this debate about Greece may be won or lost. For a change, our starting point this week is not a dateline. It's a newsmaker, the academic come politician who's out to teach Europe a thing or two about economics. At the risk of starting with a point that may seem trivial but really isn't, when is the last time a news audience watched a story about finance and debt, featuring terms like the IMF, default, and restructuring, in which one of the principals, the new Greek finance minister, isn't wearing a tie or a suit, let alone pinstripes?
Yanis Varoufakis has a very distinct approach to this whole thing by showing up in very casual clothing with a very specific message. Says, look, I'm not here to talk nonsense. I don't care about being admitted to your European club of finance boys. I have a very specific proposal. This is what we need to do. Greece is insolvent. Our debt is impossible to repay. And this is what we need to do.
So that the self-perpetuating crisis of the last 5 years can be put to an end.
He's speaking in English. He arrives without a press guard. He doesn't have security. This is totally new. He is able to communicate not just substance, there is also form.
Is Greece committed to staying in the Eurozone?
You see, the problem is that once you're in, just like you will recall the Eagles song, Hotel California, you can check out anytime you like, but you can never leave.
Although, German politicians or the German administration, or in, some cases, our editorial views may not be too happy about what he's doing there, I fully understand what he's doing. And I find his energy, his charm, his openness impressive, I have to admit. I think he has a good chance of succeeding in building a coalition and alliance that will, support, what he wants.
Yet Varoufakis and his party have been given a torrid time by the biggest-selling newspaper in Europe, Bild, the German tabloid, which wields influence in a country at the heart of this story. Among its headlines, will the triumph of the Euro scare cost us billions? No mercy for the Greeks. And Bild called Prime Minister Tsipras the Euro horror.
I would strongly contest the view that we are being fear-mongers. We believe that it is not our job to tell freely elected government of Greece what to do, but we are also free to question who's going to pick up the bill for their decisions, and that is what we are always trying to point out in our coverage, that yes, Greece can decide that they want higher pensions, but they have to come up with a convincing, credible plan who's going to pay for it.
That's like the official government line of thought that is reflected in a lot of German mainstream media. At Spiegel Online, we really tried to dig into the policies of this movement, and we found out that it's much more complex than it's portrayed in German or Western mainstream media.
If you're living in Germany and you're working your tail off and you're watching what's going on in Greece, what are you supposed to think?
It's not just let's give up austerity and let's start spending. It's also about let's broaden the tax base. Let's make our path of growth more sustainable in Greece.
Media love talking in terms of binary oppositions, and they don't like complex pictures. And obviously the two extreme binaries that were chosen to tell the story about the crisis was Germany and Greece. Again, it is interesting to see how the Syriza win might change this narrative and putting the blame not on the lazy Greeks but on the evil Germans that don't want to take lessons from their history and how their debt was reduced or wiped off actually after the Second World War.
The economics of this story are complex, well beyond the understanding of many of the political or general assignment reporters covering it, and the details remain vague. But what Syriza is saying is this. It clearly wants to delay the repayment schedule, although we don't know by how long. It also wants the schedule and the size of those payments linked to the future growth of Greece's GDP, its gross domestic product. And Syriza says it will refuse to abide by the conditions that the previous Greek government accepted from its lenders. The austerity plan that would cap the minimum wage, privatize public sector assets, and put a lid on government hiring. However, the news media are addicted to conflict, and it's much easier to sell or capture that in a headline than actually crunching the numbers and examining the economics behind a new policy.
So an example of this conflict narrative can be seen in the headline that Bloomberg had just the day before the Greek election. And it was a headline that said something along the lines that Europe is waiting while the Greeks are deciding between a reform path or defiance. And you can see there is a clear-cut distinction between reform that has positive connotations and defiance to create this kind of fear-mongering campaign against voting for Syriza.
The Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Bloomberg, those guys who are covering the debt aspect of Greece, in general, being able to use the right language with each stage of the Greek debt renegotiation story. I think the world's news media has been less clear in understanding that there are no more rules. The story has everything, but I still do think that the mainstream media is struggling to understand it.
Then there's the ideological side. Then there's the inevitability of capitalism, the inevitability of neoliberalism. The idea that a sovereign state cannot go against the markets because the markets are all-knowing. And journalists who have grown up in this, have been trained in this, have been educated in this context, can't see beyond it.
I see these ranks of economics and finance guys with their suits still pressed from Davos, standing on the hotel balconies, ranting about what's going on. It's not a finance story. It's a social and psychological revolution that's begun and will not stop.
There's an old saying that goes, if you owe the bank a little money and you can't pay, you're in trouble. If you owe a lot and you can't pay, the bank's in trouble. Europe, in this case, is part bank, part Hotel California. Greece knows it can never really leave. That makes the two sides more partners than adversaries. But in journalism, an industry with its own economic problems, conflict sells. And news outlets no doubt fear that if they toned down the conflict angle that they've been playing up,
There seems to be a lot of ambiguity in what you're saying.
circulation might decline, as would ratings. And the insolvency story the media would be looking at might be their own. On the download this week, our viewers on the way the Greek story is being reported outside the country.
The effect of the victory of Syriza on mainstream European media was quite shocking, I think. Of course, there is no unanimity about Syriza, but the main news outlets in the large European countries have adopted an attitude that varied from cold indifference to frank hostility since Syriza appeared in the European scene. To be honest, I think that many European journalists working for mainstream media believed their own spin about the crisis, that can be resumed as follows: there is no alternative to austerity.
The problem is not so much a particular internalized economic doctrine, but an additional utter lack of context. If Greece is insolvent, then further repayment is a disciplining device. The tool is the austerity program, which produces real suffering, enormous unemployment, and huge social costs. All of this is often left out.
Other media stories on our radar this week: Rupert Murdoch's news and entertainment empire, which has faced a long and expensive trip through the British court system over the phone hacking and bribery scandals, will not have to do the same in the U.S. Neither News Corporation nor 21st Century Fox, both headquartered in New York, will be prosecuted under American law after investigators spent years going through emails from the company's servers. Although the offenses were carried out on British soil, the actor Jude Law claimed that his phone had been hacked after he landed at New York's JFK Airport. The Department of Justice was also looking into alleged payments to public officials, which could have broken laws governing the actions of American companies abroad under a statute known as the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. Norman Siegel, a lawyer representing a group of relatives of 9/11 victims who suspect that they may have had their phones hacked, had issues with the decision and the way it was made. He said, "The Attorney General promised my clients that before the department published any statement, they would meet with us and explain what their inquiry had found and what their conclusions were. So this was very disappointing that they did not fulfill their promise." 11 current and former journalists with News Corp tabloids have been tried in the UK. 6 have been convicted. News Corp and 21st Century Fox have paid out more than $550 million in legal fees and settlements to phone hacking plaintiffs. When a new pan-Arab news channel launched out of Bahrain this past week, it promised a completely new style of news programming in the Middle East and beyond. If by that it meant that it would be off the air within just 12 hours, then it has delivered on its promise. The channel is called Al Arab, and it's owned by Saudi billionaire Prince Al Walid bin Talal, who also owns shares in News Corporation. Among its first segments was an interview with Bahraini opposition politician Khalil Al Marzouk. True to its stated mandate of impartiality, the channel then interviewed the Bahraini information minister. But by the next morning, Al Arab was no longer reporting the news and just had promotional material running on a loop. The channel's Twitter page said it had stopped broadcasting for technical and administrative reasons. The Financial Times quoted an anonymous source saying that officials from the information ministry came into the studios during the early morning hours to shut the channel down. And a pro-government newspaper, Akhbar Al-Khalij, eventually reported that Al Arab was suspended for, quote, not adhering to the norms prevalent in Gulf countries, unquote. Ecuador's president, Rafael Correa, has come up with a novel way to deal with his online critics. He wants to drown out those voices by recruiting an army of trolls. Correa's government has created a website called Somos Más, which translates into We Are More. Those who sign up will be notified when anyone online makes what the president calls a smear. The trolls are then invited to swamp the critics to, as Correa puts it, call out the cowards. Rafael Correa has a history of media bashing and in some cases lawsuits. He argues that like nearby Venezuela, most of the media in Ecuador have right-wing owners who are routinely hostile to his leftist agenda. Correa's principal target seems to be a satirical website called Crudo Ecuador, which likes to lampoon the president and other Ecuadorian politicians. The site's administrator, who did an interview anonymously, said since Correa's troll plan was hatched, people working at Crudo Ecuador have got death threats over Twitter. Despite that, they thanked the president for driving more traffic to their site. Here at The Listening Post, we sometimes take you behind a certain kind of story and examine the process that leads to that item making it onto the news agenda. Newscasts and newspapers frequently report on humanitarian crises, whether it's an earthquake, a tsunami, an epidemic, famine, or refugee fallout from a country at war. Telling stories of human suffering is an important part of the job, but reporters need help to do that. And more often, you'll find that NGOs, non-governmental organizations, play a central role in that process. The growth of the NGO Factor is partly due to shrinking budgets for international coverage. News outlets just don't have as many people and as much money to send them far afield. Technology plays a role too, and the communication skills that NGOs have honed in order to raise public awareness or for fundraising have morphed to the point that NGOs now provide news footage and sometimes even slick packaged reports that they produce in-house. It looks just like a news story, but considering the source, is it really? The Listening Post's Will Yong now on the symbiotic and some would say complicated relationship that exists between news organizations and NGOs.
It was 30 years ago last October that famine in Ethiopia hit the global news consciousness.
In Ethiopia, 7 million people are threatened by starvation. Thousands have already died.
Cameraman Mo Amin captured footage that was beamed across hundreds of news networks worldwide. And it was BBC reporter Michael Burke who gave voice to the story.
How do you feel about the attitude of the rest of the world to this country?
Suddenly everybody cared, and that was entirely because of the images. It was something about those children, the looks in their eyes, the flies on their eyes, all of that was so powerful. And it touched people in a way that words just couldn't. It was a very simple message. Look at this appalling suffering.
But there was a story behind the story, and it involved an NGO. Burke, under pressure from his editors in London, sent a telex to Oxfam, who directed him to a camp at Korum in northern Ethiopia. The footage shot there moved millions and sparked fundraising on an unprecedented scale. In the 3 decades since, NGOs have become skilled at using the media to raise and direct public concern. And they're not always waiting for the journalists to come to them.
So my role is really to work with researchers to help connect them to journalists, to help journalists understand what the story is, to help them figure out how to get the story, and to encourage them wherever possible to cover the human rights abuses that we're trying to publicize. We've got to know a lot of the reporters who cover those kinds of situations, and we often find ourselves working closely with them.
And the cooperation between NGOs and journalists often looks like this. Plan International worked in Indonesia in the aftermath of the Indian Ocean tsunami back in 2004. 10 years on, they're helping journalists to understand how a region like Aceh in northern Sumatra has recovered.
What we'll often do is we'll try to get journalists into an area that's been affected by an emergency. We'll also try to get them materials. These can range from photographs, video materials, case studies, and interviews so that they can use them as they see fit and help us to get the story out.
And aid agencies are much more savvy about that now than they were 20 or 30 years ago. When there is a big disaster that hits the news, we're not going out to journalists, they're coming to us.
Let's speak to Hayden Halbosson in Amman in Jordan. He's the emergency communication manager with the charity Save the Children.
They are wanting information on what's happening. Later on down the line, when the news interest has waned, then we have to be very much more proactive about finding the stories that the media might be interested in.
In the case of Ebola, the global health NGO Doctors Without Borders was raising the alarm for months before the outbreak was declared an emergency. And as the story went global, many of the journalists heading to West Africa went to NGOs not just for information, but for access.
Both in Sierra Leone and in Liberia, the Doctors Without Borders organization is playing a very critical role in the response to Ebola. So to a degree, journalists are following the activities of these various organizations. They're going to their treatment centers. And if you don't have the types of resources that you need from the organization that's supporting you, you can be in a position where you become dependent on the NGOs because they have the type of infrastructure to support you. They have vehicles. They are making oftentimes the same type of journey that you may need to make.
There certainly are ethical issues if you accept hospitality from an aid agency, and it's quite complicated because maybe there's nowhere to stay apart from with the aid agency in some remote part of the world. And so if you've accepted their hospitality, does that mean you've got to say nice things about their project if it's lousy? No, it doesn't, because your job as a journalist is to tell the truth.
Away from the field too, NGOs are moving into territory that the media are vacating. With news budgets shrinking and fewer foreign correspondents to bear witness, NGOs are filling the vacuum with their own content, whether it's raw footage, interviews with locals, or fully produced packages complete with voiceover like this one that could easily be mistaken for a news report.
Husbands and their families pay a bride price or dowry in exchange for the girls.
Over the past decade, I would say we've really started to use photography and video much more extensively. We are assigning photographers and producing video in particular that we will also distribute to media outlets, because in this era of diminished budgets, and combined with the fact that now everybody has a website, whether they're print, radio, TV, everybody wants video, and we'll make that footage available to media companies, you know, at no cost.
And that harks back to the Michael Burke report, you know, because we know that those kind of pictures are so powerful. Whereas before we might just present somebody with a case study of a person who was affected by a disaster, we would now have pictures of that person. We would probably try to have video of that person, look at what photography and video we can provide.
But if NGOs are telling the stories of crises that are their job to raise awareness about, and sometimes also raise money for, it begs the question. When an NGO points the camera and not a journalist, do audiences get the whole picture?
I think it's great if NGOs provide information on what they're doing, but it is not the same thing as a journalist on the ground reporting what she or he sees with her own eyes. It's a completely different thing. It may be very important, it may be very informative, but it's always from an aid agency point of view.
You certainly see that the different organizations that you interact with, of course, have their specific focus. And that can be very helpful so long as you maintain distance required to see the other dimensions of the story. These organizations are not in the media business, of course, and our job is quite different than theirs. So I think it's really essential that we maintain our independence and try to be vigilant about buying into any particular narrative that's presented by a specific organization.
The collaboration between journalists and NGOs is a complex partnership that, as news organizations try to do more with less, is growing more important. The BBC was not the first news organization to call an NGO for help. Ethiopia in 1984 is just one of the best-known cases of a relationship between those who are out to report the world's humanitarian problems and those doing what they can to solve them.
More viewers on the download now on NGOs and their impact on news coverage.
What is potentially concerning about the increasing trend of international journalists being embedded with the INGOs is that, in all likelihood, in many cases, the same resources which are directed at working with local media and communication with the communities are also the resources that get directed at chaperoning and handling the international journalists. So my main worry will be that we would see a backslide in the progress that has been made in getting life-saving information out to communities affected by disasters.
From my own experiences working with NGOs as a freelance journalist, I found that they can facilitate access to difficult terrains and provide useful case studies and research based on detailed local knowledge, which can be useful when under time and budget constraints. However, journalists and media outlets need to work to maintain their objectivity and ensure that this symbiotic relationship doesn't result in NGOs controlling their own narrative.
Finally, technology, entertainment, and design. That was the original brief when a bunch of Silicon Valley innovators put their heads together more than 20 years ago to launch the much-heralded TED Talks. More than 1,900 talks later, TED has grown. Speakers strut the stage with their wireless mics and deliver what TED calls ideas worth spreading. But at a TEDx event in New York last month, the organization allowed a little bit of fun to be poked at itself. It collaborated with Will Steven of collegehumor.com, who deconstructed the typical TED Talk. The result has gone viral. His talk had everything except an idea, and still, it's spreading. We'll see you next time here at The Listening Post.
Hear that? That's nothing. Which is what I, as a speaker at today's conference, have for you all. I have nothing. Nothing smart, nothing inspirational, nothing even remotely researched at all. I'm going to make it intellectual. I'm going to bring it to this man right here. Now, what this man did was important, I'm sure. But I, for one, have no idea who he is. I simply Google image the word scientist. I'm going to make it seem like I'm building to a moment. And what if I was? You know, if there's one thing you take away from my talk, I'd like you to think about what you heard at the beginning, and I'd like you to think about what you hear now. Because it was nothing, and it's still nothing. Think about that.